Well, welcome everyone. And I'm very happy that you could make it. This Graeco-Aegyptiaca series has been going now for 4 years. It's co-organized by the Department of Greek and Latin at UCL and by Palladion, which is a kind of cultural and educational NGO based in Budapest. And with that, that's basically all I wanted to say, and I'll pass the word over now to Agi Mihaiko, our colleague, who will introduce our speaker.
Yes, thank you, Peter, for organizing this and for Arpad. And I'm very much honored to be able to introduce to you Korshi Dosoo, my friend and colleague, who is the specialist on Coptic magic. I can safely say that. Korshi holds a PhD from Macquarie University, where he studied the Theban magical library and especially apparition rituals. And after that, he went to Paris for a postdoc there. And he also was a lecturer at Strasbourg. But then he had a project on the Coptic Magical Papyri, vernacular religion, Coptic vernacular religion, for 5 years at the University of Würzburg, of which he was junior leader. And in the framework of this project, he and his team members created the wonderful Kyprianos database, where you can really find everything that you would like to know about Coptic magical papyri. Plus, they had really nice blog entries and podcasts on this topic as well. And currently, he is one of the primary investigators of another project on Coptic magical papyri. And he has also recently submitted his habilitation, The Three Lives of Cyprian, which treats not only Coptic magical papyri, about which you can learn a lot from this habilitation, but he also has an incredible grasp on virtually every aspect of the magical tradition, including the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri, and also the Christian magic after late antiquity. It is a really wonderful read. I have had the honor and luck to read it, and we are looking forward to it to become a book soon, as I have just learned. Yes, the topic of today's paper will be about about multilingual scribes in magical sorry, Korshi, I think I will just leave this over to you. I forgot to check the title precisely. But with this, I will let the floor over to Korshi. And thank you for accepting the invitation. Exactly, yes. And the floor is yours, Korshi.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Agnes, for that very kind introduction. And also to Peter and to Arpad for the invitation to speak, and to everyone who's here. So today, as Agnes said, I mainly work nowadays on the Coptic magical papyri, but I'm still interested in older material. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is, I guess, a little bit of the prehistory of Coptic magical texts, that is to say, Egyptian language magical texts, which we find mixed in with or alongside the Greek magical texts. I'll be talking about essentially the interaction between Egyptian and Greek material in the magical papyri from early Roman Egypt. Here's a quick overview of what I'm going to be essentially talking about today. I'll begin with trying to give an overview of the linguistic landscape of Roman Egypt. This is a very big topic, so I'll only really be able to give a very basic overview, and we can perhaps discuss it more in the questions if you're interested. I'll then try to introduce briefly how this landscape led to the introduction of Coptic and the different ways in which Greek and Egyptian interacted with one another leading up to the development of Coptic. I'll then look at this interaction specifically in magical papyri, and I'll do this through looking at 4 different phenomena that we find in which Greek and Egyptian interact with one another. So the first is pseudo-Egyptian, so that is fake Egyptian words or not real Egyptian words which we find in Greek text, but which claim to be Egyptian. In terms of Egyptian loanwords that we find in Greek magical texts, in terms of code switching, so that's switching from one language to another in the middle of a text, and then in terms of Old Coptic, so this is essentially the Egyptian language written in the Greek alphabet or a modified version of the Greek alphabet, and then the way in which this Old Coptic script is used to both preserve older texts, often much older texts, but also as a way to begin to compose new ones. So a kind of, in history, we always say it's about kind of continuity and change. And so we'll see both of these processes at work in the process of the development of Old Coptic magical texts. I hope that's interesting for everyone here. I'm a little bit worried that it may be a bit too specialist for some people and maybe a little bit too general for others. But again, the questions at the end are perhaps where we can discuss things in more or less detail if you're interested. And as Agnes said, this is part of a larger project, to which Agnes has already alluded. And if you're interested in finding out more about things which I'm talking about, you can go to our website, the Coptic Magical Papyrus Project. If you Google Coptic Magical Papyri, you should find the website, and there you have access to our database and our blogs, and also the ways to contact me and the other members of the team if you're interested in discussing any of the questions in more detail. Specifically today, actually, a lot of the stuff which I'm presenting actually came out of a project which I'm also part of, the Greek and Egyptian Magical Formulas Project, based at Chicago and Princeton, and headed by Christopher Pharaonic and Sofia Tovar. This is a project in which we're re-editing all of the Greek and demotic and Old Coptic magical formularies from Roman Egypt. And in the process of these in particular, I've been looking again at PGM3 and PGM4, which are 2 of the largest surviving collections of Old Coptic magical texts. So I should say that my colleague Edward Love has already studied these and done a lot of work on them, but in the course of coming back to them and doing final edits, I discovered lots of interesting things, or things which I find interesting, and some of the work which I'll be presenting today grew out of that. And so some of it's still work in progress, but I hope that you once again find it interesting nonetheless. So the linguistic landscape of Roman Egypt, as probably every other part of the Roman Empire, was very complex. But in the case of Egypt, we have a lot of evidence for this in the case of the papyri. So the papyri survive almost exclusively from Upper Egypt, so that is Egypt south of the Delta. But nonetheless, they show us the huge range of languages which were being used. So at the end, you can see a list of all of the languages which are tested in some form or another, usually as papyri or inscriptions in Roman Egypt. So I have Aramaic, Hebrew, Meroitic, Punic, Middle Persian, Tamil, Armenian, etc. A fair few Latin texts, in particular from the 4th century. But the 2 main languages which we're interested in here are Greek and Egyptian. So of course, Greek is the language of the Greeks, which was introduced to Egypt in the 4th century, in the middle of the 4th century, after the conquest of Alexander. And after that, from that point until the 7th or really 8th century, so basically from the conquest of Alexander until the Abbasid period, Greek was really the main language which was being used in Egypt as a language of administration, of literature, of science, and so on. The traditional Egyptian language, so this is the Egyptian which you already have attested in writing in the pyramid texts. This continued to be used, especially as a spoken language, but from the Roman period onwards, it became a lot less important as a written language, even though it did continue in various forms. I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is that there's a relationship between Greek and Egyptian, and it's a structured relationship. So Greek is dominant in the Roman period in certain domains, the domain of administration, also, I guess, elite culture in most cases, the legal system. Egyptian still survives, but its sphere of use is increasingly restricted. So in the Roman period, the majority of the surviving texts that we have concern religious literature or magic, sometimes medicine, and we have a few private letters and contracts in the Roman period, but really it's been declining considerably in use. when we look at Egyptian in more detail, it's important to point out that Egyptian is not a monolith. So it's a language which continued to evolve like all other languages over time. So as scholars, we typically divide Egyptian into two major phases. So the first phase Egyptian and the second phase Egyptian. A very simple way to think about the difference is that first phase Egyptian is more synthetic, so it's maybe a bit more like Latin or something like that. That is, the word changes to reflect the change in gender, the change in number. Verbs change to reflect reflect things like tense and mood. In second phase Egyptian, you tend to signal these changes in a more analytic manner. So instead of changing the word itself, you might add an article, which is either masculine or feminine or plural, and that's what tells you whether the word is masculine, feminine, or plural. And you tend to use periphrasis to express different meanings of the verb. So that is, you have the verb to do or to give, something like this, and you conjugate that, but then you always use the infinitive. So it's a shift from something that's like Latin, something that's maybe a little bit more like English in terms of the way that it functions. In the Roman period, the phases that are important for us are what we call traditional Egyptian or late Middle Egyptian or classical Egyptian, depending which school you belong to. So this is a form of the language which is similar to the classical form, which is Middle Egyptian, but which is still being used as a kind of fossilized learned form, you could say. So when you see these kinds of royal inscriptions, they're using something like first phase Egyptian, so what we might call traditional Egyptian. It uses constructions which are essentially archaic or obsolete in the spoken language, but which continue to be used in writing. The second phase Egyptian, the two phases which are important for us are demotic and then Coptic. So demotic developed around the 6th or 7th century BCE as a kind of more progressive form of the language. It was closer to the spoken language at the time it was spoken. Of course, there was a written script which went along with it, which is a very cursive form of hieroglyphs. So you can see it here on this stela. That was still being used in the Roman period, but it declined considerably from the 1st century onwards. And so this is where it starts to be restricted to being only used in the sphere of the priests, in the priesthood. So priests will use it for private contracts and for letters amongst themselves, but the general population tend not to use it. And Greek becomes the primary language of, for example, private letters or contracts. Coptic is a later form, which has a lot of similarities to Demotic in terms of its grammar, its vocabulary, especially the later texts we have written in Demotic. But the big distinction in terms of Coptic, identifying Coptic text, is that it uses a different alphabet. It uses a modified form of the Greek alphabet. So until we get to Coptic, all of the older forms of the language are written using the traditional script. So hieroglyphs, the hieratic form, hieratic, which is the cursive form of hieroglyphs, and demotic, which is an even more cursive form, which develops from hieratic. So I won't go into much detail now about exactly what that difference looks like, but we can return to it later if anybody's interested. As I mentioned, so Greek in Egypt had been around for a very long time. It was probably first spoken in Egypt by Greek mercenaries. Well, probably it was first spoken perhaps by visitors to Egypt. In the Bronze Age already, we have some hints of contact between Greece and the Mycenaeans. But in terms of large numbers of Greeks in Egypt, we have evidence from the Saite period when we start to have Greek mercenaries employed by the pharaohs. And there you can see a famous inscription by a Greek mercenary from Elephantine. And then, of course, it becomes the elite language and language administration under the Ptolemies and Alexander, and finally becomes confirmed as the almost only administrative and legal language under the Romans. So there are a lot of a lot of questions that we don't really have answers to in terms of the way in which bilingualism functioned. So we know that there were Greek speakers in Egypt, so native Greek speakers, but it's unclear how many they were compared to the Egyptian speakers, and it's also unclear to what extent Greek speakers would typically be bilingual, so to what extent Greek speakers would learn Egyptian. We don't have a lot of evidence for that in the Roman period. So it seems that generally speaking, Egyptian speakers would learn Greek, and whereas the opposite case of Greek speakers learning Egyptian is rarer. So even when we have learned authors like Origen, like Clement of Alexandria, like Plotinus, who grew up in Egypt and lived in Egypt, when they discuss the Egyptian language, they tend to do it in quite a stereotyped fashion. They don't seem to have a very deep knowledge of the language. So that is to say that somebody who grew up speaking Greek in Egypt probably didn't learn a lot of Egyptian. From the point of pronunciation. Egyptian Greek was quite conservative. So this will be a little bit important later, but it tended to conserve archaic Attic pronunciations of letters like ki and phi, for example, later than was the case elsewhere in the Greek-speaking world. So alongside the rise in importance of of Greek, we have the decline of the importance and role of demotic in Egypt. So the exact reason for this is still debated, but one major factor seems to be that in the Roman period, it became necessary to have Greek language subscriptions on legal documents, regardless of the language of the document itself. So that is to say, if somebody went to a demotic language scribe to write a contract for them, they would still then need to have somebody write a summary and a subscription in Greek. So this means that it's easier to go to a Greek-speaking scribe because you know the scribe is going to be able to write the whole thing in Greek, and so the majority of the population who are literate no longer have real reason to go to demotic literate scribes. So this means that outside areas of the Fayum, where we have a lot of evidence from temples, we tend not to have demotic documents after the 1st century CE. And even in the Fayum and in other regions where demotic continued to be used, we tend not to have many demotic documents after the 2nd century. Where it did survive to an extent was in the sphere of religion, but of course there are many fewer religious documents being produced regularly than there are documents, so contracts and letters and so on. That's where the vast majority of documents are being created. The last demotic inscription comes from Philae in the 450s, but this is produced by a very small priesthood who are still installed in Philae, who consist at this point of just a single family, and they're operating the temple because of a deal made between the Romans and the Nubians of the area. So as part of a ceasefire which was made between them, the Romans allowed the Nubians continued access to the temple, which is why it remained open, but the majority of temples of Upper Egypt were closed in the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th centuries. So one other thing to mention is that, of course, demotic is a relatively complicated language to learn, or not a complicated language to learn, but let's say a complicated script to learn. So the Greek alphabet has 24 letters, if I remember correctly, whereas in demotic, there are over 50 uniconsonantal signs, which are then typically used alongside something like 350 ideographs and multiconsonantal signs. So this means that as a script, it's much richer. The amount of information that you can communicate in the written language is much deeper than is possible with the Greek alphabet, and we can see this in the ambiguity, for example, of homophones in Coptic, which are more clearly distinguishable in demotic. But it also means that it requires much more time to learn the language and then much more active practice to remain literate in it. So this may also have been a factor in its decline, although this is a somewhat controversial point. If you have a more complicated script, it requires more time to learn and then more active use to remain in use. So this may have been another factor as the number of people who are using demotic shrunk, as the priesthoods within which it was being taught and studied shrank, it perhaps became harder to sustain as a written language. So this brings us to what Joachim Quack calls Graeco-Egyptian writing, which is one of the first ways in which we see Greek and Egyptian interacting. So Graeco-Egyptian writing refers to the writing of Egyptian, the Egyptian language, but in Greek script. And this is something which we start to see from around the 6th century, mainly in the form of personal names, being written. So personal Egyptian names being written in Greek. So typically names of pharaohs like Amasis or Psametikos. And occasionally from around 3rd century BCE, we find entire phrases or at least individual words being written. So for example, there's a very nice case of in Heidelberg of a papyrus, which seems to be a kind of phrase book or a dictionary, where you have one Greek word and then its Egyptian equivalent next to it, but the Egyptian equivalent is written using the Greek script. So this form of interaction is fairly unsystematic. So it seems that there's no fixed way of transcribing from Egyptian into Greek, even though there are certain tendencies that we can see. These texts are often difficult to understand. There are relatively few of them, but they seem to represent cases in which somebody who could speak Egyptian wants to write something, and perhaps they don't have access to the Egyptian alphabet, and so instead they use the Greek alphabet, which is easier to learn, which they've learned for I guess for Greek literacy, and so this produces an interesting phenomenon. There are really only two texts of any length in this Greco-Egyptian in Greco-Egyptian script. One of these is a very interesting case which comes from Saqqara in the 2nd century. It basically consists of a short account of a dream, or two dreams that somebody saw. The letter is written in Greek, so it says the date of the dream, the first dream that this person, Nektonbes, saw about the twins and me. So this is Apollonius writing. He says that the person, Nektonbes, so obviously an Egyptian name, saw him, and he said to me, "Greetings to you, Nektonbes." So not a very interesting dream, but for whatever reason, he decided to write it down and to send it to his correspondent. But the second dream, you can see that it consists of a series of strange words, which I haven't translated because we don't know the translation. Paperesienrex, pauni, and then a short passage which is comprehensible in the Bubasteion, the temple of Bastus. Knemeni, in the house of Amun, Pel, Lel, Kasonkani. So we have a vague idea of perhaps the kinds of things this might say. So for example, the p at the beginning are probably the definite articles. But apart from that, it's very hard to make sense of what he's trying to say. And this shows one of the big problems of the Greek-Egyptian script, because there's no fixed grammar, because there's no fixed orthography. It can be very hard to make sense of these. The other one that we have is a graffito from Abydos, I think, which describes one of the pharaohs who rebelled, one of the native pharaohs who rebelled against the Ptolemies. That one's a little bit easier to understand, but even there, the text is not fully understood. So Greco-Egyptian texts are very interesting, but they kind of represent a little bit of a dead end and they're among really the most difficult texts for us to read as scholars. The next thing, which is where we start to see the real beginning of Coptic develop, are in glosses to hieratic and later demotic texts. So as I mentioned with demotic, hieratic is a fairly complicated script to learn. It's not phonetic, so you need to be able to recognize the individual signs or the words as a whole to be able to read it. And again, this means that if you're not using it actively, or there are archaic words, it can become easy to not be able to read a word, or to misread a word, or for there to be ambiguity. And so one thing that we start to see from the 2nd century BCE is the use of annotations to hieratic script. These are usually hymns and other kinds of ritual texts. And you can see in this text, so you can see the main text in hieratic. Here you can see some text in demotic. But I think if we look, yeah, there's demotic as well. I think here we have the end of a word which is written in Greek. And there we have a little bit of Greek, and in fact mixed with demotic. So essentially they start to use Greek and demotic glosses to clarify the word which is being used, because Greek and demotic are a little bit more transparent than hieratic. So what's quite interesting about this is that we start to see a mixture of the Greek and demotic script. So there you have mint, but then we have a sign afterwards. So we have 4 Greek signs followed by a demotic sign. So already they're starting to use demotic to supplement the failures of Greek, so to speak, in regards to the Egyptian Egyptian pronunciation system. So there are certain sounds which can't be represented easily by Greek signs, and so to fill in these lacunae, they start to use demotic signs. So again, we have another example here. Here, once again, it's in hieratic, but we can see that the glosses are no longer in demotic, but purely in Greek, with the occasional addition of demotic signs. But the next kind of typological stage, so the first typological stage we can say is the use of glosses, individual glossed words. But here you can see a text, once again a hieratic, but where you have a continual gloss. So that is to say, every single word of the line has a gloss which tells you how to pronounce it. So somebody who is able to read the Greek script and knew a few demotic signs would be able to read the entire hieratic text without actually being able to read any hieratic. And so this seems to be the next stage. As people's knowledge of hieratic declines even more, you start to have parallel texts where one text is legible to hieratic literates, but one text is literate to people who are only literate in Greek and who don't have any access to the hieratic text itself. So from here, then, it's a fairly obvious step to extract the glosses. So sorry, where are we? I think I'm missing a slide. But the next obvious thing to do is then to extract the glosses and to have continuous texts. And when we extract the glosses and have just a continuous text written in Greek with added demotic signs now and then, we start to have what is called Old Coptic. And so here you can see an example of an Old Coptic text. This is a letter to a god, so it's a letter by a woman to Osiris, basically asking for help with a personal problem that she has. The language is probably fairly close to demotic in terms of its constructions. There are some archaisms which you wouldn't find in Coptic, but you can see it's almost entirely written in the Greek script with only a few signs added. And these few signs are what distinguish it as Old Coptic as opposed to Graeco-Egyptian. So for those of you who can read Greek, you can see, for example, in this word here, you have our rho, so this is the r sound, and there are two demotic signs which precede it. But these demotic signs are not ones which survive in this form in Coptic. What we have is a sign which is read as or can be transcribed as H, so it'd be H. The next sign is actually the backbone, which would be pronounced as O in this period. So you can read the whole word as Hor, which is the name of the god Horus in Egyptian. So Hor, Horus. So you can see that it's an Old Coptic text in the sense that it mixes Greek with demotic, but the signs that they use and the grammar that it uses are archaic in regards to standard Coptic. So this is just the basic signs which survive into standard Coptic. All of these are found also in Old Coptic texts, although the exact forms they take are sometimes different. So you can see they come from hieroglyphic signs. These hieroglyphic signs have become cursive as they pass through the hieratic and then demotic stages. Finally, they're borrowed into Coptic. And you can see in particular that they're used to write sounds which don't exist in Greek at the time, or at least in Egyptian Greek. So you have shai, which is pronounced as sh, phi, which is pronounced as f. This is important because the Greek letter phi is pronounced as p still in Egypt. So an aspirated bilabial stop. For hori, you have h. So of course in Greek you have the rough breathing, which could represent this. But if you want to have it in the middle of the word, it's easier to use a new sign to represent it. You have janja, which is something like ch. You have kima, which is something like kya, or ch. And then you have kai, which is something like ch, because again, the ki in Greek was still pronounced as k, so an aspirated velar stop. So we can see, so what I've tried to give you very briefly is the development of Coptic, or really Old Coptic, through this process of first glosses and then writing full texts by mixing Greek and Egyptian alphabets together. So we have these four typological stages: the development of Greco-Egyptian writing, then a system of Greek glosses, then the extraction of these glosses to create entire Old Coptic systems, and then finally the standardization of one of these systems in what we call Standard Coptic. Now, these Old Coptic texts are quite diverse, but also quite few in number. So you can see I've marked the Old Coptic texts that I know of and where they're from and also their dates. You can see they're quite widely scattered, and typically from each site we only have one or two or a very small group of texts. And it seems that in each location we also have a different system. So it seems that what happened is each geographical priesthood developed its own Old Coptic system with its own dialectal peculiarities and its own choice of the demotic signs which it borrowed. So we have multiple systems, and one of these, probably none of these which we see here, developed into Standard Coptic. So one of the other things that's important to say about Coptic, and which is also true of Old Coptic, is that it's not a centralized language in the same way that Egyptian Koine Greek was, or in which most modern languages are. So that is to say, we see a lot of dialectal variation in the writing. And this will become important later on in this discussion. because this dialectal variation often allows us to say where a text probably or certainly comes from, even in fact when the manuscript has been found in a different area. So here's a map giving you the very rough geographical origins of the major dialects of Coptic. The ones which are most important for us today are Achaemenic. So this is the southernmost dialect that we know of. So Achaemenic, often abbreviated to A. Sahidic, which comes from the Arabic Saidi, which refers to Upper Egypt. It seems to be the kind of vehicular or prestige dialect of the entire southern part of Egypt. So it's found very widely, even though its geographical origin is probably somewhere here in the southern part of Middle Egypt. There's also the Fayumic dialect, which is, of course, the dialect of the Fayum, which is this little area, a kind of oasis off the Nile Valley. And then there's Bohairic, which is the northernmost dialect, which we're aware of. Now, Lower Egypt, which is from which we have almost no papyri surviving and certainly no magical papyri, was probably the area which is most densely populated in antiquity, as it is today. My colleague Matthias Müller has pointed out that, in fact, in modern Egyptian Arabic, there are several dialects in the Delta. And so it's quite likely that this was also the case in antiquity. So technically, Bohairic is the dialect of a region which is called the Buhaira, which is the Western Delta, including, I think, Alexandria. So we should say really that it's the dialect of this part of Egypt, and there may be other dialects which are completely lost, which were also once present in Lower Egypt. I won't go into detail about the differences, but you can see here just a rough idea of the differences we're talking about. So the word for skin, sha'ar, khare, or shell, depending on the dialect. So dialects are different. The differences are relatively small, but they're still significant. That is, if we see a text in one dialect, we can usually identify it by its phonological features and occasionally grammatical features. So finally, after all of that, we get to talk about magical texts. So I won't go into a lot of detail here about defining magical texts, but in terms of papyrology, when we talk about a magical text, we're usually talking about a specific kind of text which has specific genre features. So these genre features are linguistic forms, things like invocations or adjurations. So I invoke you, Hermes, I adjure you, great demon, something like that. Very often at the end of text, we have phrases like quickly, quickly, now, now. Typically, we have magical names, which are often called voces magicae or onomata barbara. So Ablanathanalba, Abrasax, Akramakamari, things like that. We often find short stories called historioli, which are meant to kind of create a precedent. So in the mythic past, such and such god was healed. In the present day, by speaking the story, we also heal a human patient who we want to be healed of the same problem. We often find characteras, so symbols like this, so these kinds of magical, unreadable signs that are meant to represent a divine language. And we sometimes also find various images. I think you can maybe see there's actually a drawing of a foot. So this is a relatively simple drawing, but we often find more dramatic drawings of things like demons and angels and gods and so on. And in terms of the goals of these texts, they tend to be for goals such as protection and or healing or exorcism. They may curse enemies, so they may curse them to be bound, to failure, to sickness, or even death. They may be intended to bring about love, so to make somebody fall in love with somebody else, to bring about favor, so general kind of social success. And especially in the Greek and demotic papyri from the Roman period, they may be for divination. So that is typically by evoking a god or spirit to appear to you and talk to you directly to reveal answers about hidden things. So we've talked a little bit about the relationship between the different languages. So here I've given you a graph of the shift in language that we see in Egyptian formularies. So what's important is not really the absolute number because, of course, different numbers of papyri survive from every century, from different centuries. And so you can't really compare the first and the second and third century without having a better idea of the larger number of papyri that have been found from that century. But rather, what I think is interesting is the rise and decline of various languages. So you can see that demotic, there are several demotic texts from the early early Greek and Roman period, the first and second, and maybe even 3rd century, but I actually suspect this is wrong. The majority of the texts in demotic really date from the 1st and 2nd century. But after that, there's a significant decline as literacy in all as the number of demotic texts in general declines significantly. Greek is important all at the beginning of our period, but the vast majority of surviving Greek magical papyri come from between the 2nd and 4th centuries. In terms of Coptic manuscripts, we start to see Old Coptic manuscripts in the 2nd and 3rd century, but from the 4th century, we start to see large numbers. And so you can see by around the 5th, 6th century, we start to see Coptic overtake Greek as a language of magic in Egypt. But the period I'm going to be focusing on here is kind of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. So this is the period in which we have Greek as the dominant language, but we still have some demotic and some Coptic texts being used. So this is the period in which we see a lot of this interesting interaction, which later on leads to the development of a Coptic magical practice. So the first of the forms of interaction, which is not really a form of interaction, you could say, is the presence of pseudo-Egyptian in the Greek magical texts. This is sometimes something we find occasionally. So in many of the texts, including this one, PGM 13, we find attempts to draw upon exotic or divine languages as a way of gaining power in magic. And sometimes this divine language is named, sometimes it is Hebrew, sometimes it's Syrian, sometimes it's Aramaic. But in this case, we have Egyptian. So they're addressing a god. It says your fundamental, your fuzikon name in Egyptian is Aldabiaim. And then in one text, it says, this means the bark, so the boat in which the sun god sails, in which he ascends, rising over the world. So this is quite interesting because it's obviously referencing a real Egyptian religious idea. So the idea that the sun god travels in a bark, he ascends from the underworld, he rises, and then he sets again. But Aldabiaim does not seem to be an Egyptian word. I couldn't make any sense of it. It looks a lot more like a name of pseudo Hebrew origin. So this im ending, it looks like a masculine plural in Hebrew. And also Alda at the beginning. This could relate to perhaps Yalda, which would mean something like child or youth in Hebrew. So it seems that what they've done is they've taken a magical name, they've interpreted it as being Egyptian in the text, and then later on in one of the copies of this text, it's been interpreted as a real word in Egyptian. So this would imply that the person who composed this text wanted to draw upon the knowledge of Egyptian without really having any access to it as a real language. But what's quite interesting is that the scribe who copied it, the scribe whose hand you see here, his Greek is very bad, or his written Greek is very bad. He makes all kinds of phonetic mistakes, grammatical mistakes. You can see there's a lot of corrections and even text added, which implies, especially the phonetic mistakes, it implies that the scribe himself is actually Egyptian. So we have here an interesting case of someone who's probably an Egyptian speaker copying a Greek text, which has pseudo-Egyptian in it. So it's one of these kinds of very interesting linguistic interactions which we see sometimes in the magical papyri. At the same time, though, there are actually a lot of real Egyptian loanwords in the magical papyri, and they're often signaled in the same way. So for example, here we have a text. It's for foreknowledge from PGM 3, which we'll return to later. And it says, take a hoopoe, which in Egyptian is called kakufat, and tear out its heart. So obviously not a very pleasant recipe, but an interesting one because once again, a word is given which is highlighted as being Egyptian. And in fact, it is a real word in this case. So here you can see that we have the word kokofat, which really is, or kokopat, which is really an Egyptian word. There you have the demotic, the form which is set in demotic, kekapet, and it really does mean hoopoe. What's interesting, though, is that this word was borrowed into Greek. So even though here it's singled out as being an Egyptian word, it was borrowed into Greek, and it does appear in Greek texts, including the magical papyri. It's borrowed in the form kokofas or kokofadion, a diminutive. So here I've given you a list of some of the real Egyptian words, which we find in the magical papyri. And you can see there's quite a lot of them. There are probably some which I've missed. But some of these, like Anok, Manto, Skiati, these are words which you only find in the magical papyri, and in some cases of Manto and Skiati, we only find them once. But in other cases, like Bais, Baris, Ibis, komi. These are just normal Greek words, which you could find in a text from anywhere. They just happen to be Egyptian loanwords. So there are lots of interesting things that we could say about this, but I wanted to focus on just a few of them. The first is the spheres which they belong to. So whenever languages interact, there's a kind of structured interaction between them depending on the relationship which they have socially. So one thing which I suppose anybody who speaks any modern language will notice is that there are a lot of loan words in English in most modern languages. And that's, of course, because for various historical reasons, English has become the major international language. It's the language of international diplomacy, the language of programming, for example. And so we see this reflected in the words which are borrowed. So very often words which relate to business, which relate to information technology, even sometimes which relate to entertainment, so filmmaking and so on, these will be borrowed from English. And so we can see something similar here. In Greek, there are relatively few Egyptian words borrowed because, as we've said, Greek was the elite language, but they often relate to things like particular technology. So baris, this is a particular from Egyptian beer. This is a particular type of boat which existed in Egypt, and so the Greeks chose to borrow an Egyptian word to refer to it. Other words refer to the natural world, so they refer to objects, living objects that they find in Egypt. So, for example, bai became bais, which refers to palm branch. Achi became ake, which refers to a type of reed. Ibis, of course, is a bird which didn't exist. And of course, the Greeks didn't have to do this. They could just take existing Greek words and use them to refer to Egyptian realities. So, for example, the word for crocodile in Greek, krokodelos, actually was a type of small lizard in Greece. And so they just borrowed a word for lizard and started calling crocodiles lizard. But nonetheless, they did choose to borrow certain Egyptian words to refer to certain living things. You can see here that perhaps the largest sphere that we see in the magical text relates to ritual and religion. So I've put most of them in the same color to reflect that. So for example, we have the word ethies, which refers to somebody who had drowned and therefore acquired a kind of sanctified state. We have kufi, which refers to a type of incense which was used in the temples. We have wation, which refers in magical papyri to the eye of Horus. We have stimi, which is a kind of eye paint, which you might use in rituals. So you can see here that these are typically words which refer to ritual processes or ritual concepts or religious concepts. And we can even see this being true for certain examples of the words relating to the natural world and technology. So for example, the word ibis refers not just to a bird, but to a sacred animal. And the word baris refers not just to a type of boat, but also to the boat in which the sun god sails, as we've seen. And actually, so we looked at this fake Egyptian word, the pseudo-Egyptian word al-Dabiyaim. In fact, the real words which were used to refer to the boat of the sun god, so baris, but also manto and skiati, which refer to specific names of the barks used by the sun god at day and at night. We actually do seem to find these in magical papyri. So even though that case wasn't a real case of an Egyptian word being used, we do find it. So apart from the domain from which these words are borrowed, the other thing which I wanted to focus on was the dialect. So this is perhaps a little bit controversial because the degree to which the dialects reflect writing conventions versus real differences in the pronunciation or the grammar of the dialects is controversial, but I tend to think that it does the writing system does reflect real differences in pronunciation in the dialects. And what we can see is that in many cases, the word or the form of the word which is borrowed reflects the Bohairic dialect. So you can see here that of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 words which I've selected here, I think 7 of them are in Bohairic. So that is the majority. And if we look again at our map, we can see that Bohairic is the northernmost dialect. So this makes sense because, of course, Greeks who are coming to Egypt, the first Egyptians who they're going to come into contact with, and perhaps most intensely if they're living around the Delta, are going to speak something like Bohairic. So this is not so surprising for these loanwords. But it does tell us that when these words are used in Greek text from Egypt, even if they're found in Upper Egypt, these are words which came into the Greek language further north, even if they're being used in the Greek language in manuscripts from further south. So the next thing which I wanted to talk about was the integration of the Egyptian language into Greek manuscripts. So the first example of this is actually in demotic. Here, this is from the manuscript PGM12. This is a very long roll, which is mainly written in Greek. Actually, the back is written in demotic. So the back is a demotic literary text called The Myth of the Sun's Eye. But at a later date, after that literary text had been written, the manuscript was turned over and the verso was used to write a series of magical recipes. The majority of those, which is all of these columns which I've put in this color, are in Greek, but there are certain columns which we find Greek and demotic mixed together. So we have typically demotic recipes with Greek formulae or vice versa, or in which we find only demotic. That's the case, I think, in the first column. So here we're in the Greek section. So it says a dactylidion, so a little ring for success and favor and victory. And so it goes into description of the ritual for creating and consecrating a ring so that the person who wears it will be successful and victorious. But what's interesting is that in the space between this recipe and the preceding one, somebody has added a little title in demotic which says, well, to use the Coptic pronunciation, uksur, so which means a ring. So this is interesting because, of course, this is kind of, you could say that it's unnecessary. We already have the title here at the beginning. But this implies that the person who was using this manuscript was primarily literate in demotic. And so when they were scrolling through the scroll quickly, they probably wanted to be able to have something that jumped out at them. And perhaps they're particularly interested in this recipe. So all of these manuscripts have things that are interesting, or many things that are interesting about them, but what's interesting perhaps about this particular feature is that it tells us that somebody who was primarily reading demotic was still interested in a Greek manuscript and still interested in annotating it to make it easier for them to use. We actually find something similar, though, in entirely Greek language manuscripts occasionally. So this is one which is, sorry, that should be a V for fourth, it's 3rd or 4th century. It's a little bit later. The previous one was 2nd century. Here we have a series of entirely Greek recipes. These are in particular for catching thieves. So if something has been stolen from you and you want to figure out who did it and bring them to justice, this recipe tells you basically to draw a picture of an eye and you put onions on it and you speak a formula, and this will cause the eye of the thief to start watering so that they're easy to identify. It's also a form of torture, I suppose, to make sure that they come back to you. But what's interesting is that in this series of recipes, very often in a manuscript of this type, they will add a title which just says another. So rather than saying a recipe for catching a thief, a recipe for catching a thief, a recipe for catching a thief, each time there's a new recipe, they'll replace a recipe for catching a thief by another or something similar. So in Greek, this would be alos or alon, but they've actually not used a Greek word. They've instead used an Egyptian word, kete, which means another. So we find this same word in the form kit used in the demotic manuscripts. This implies again that this is a Greek manuscript, which was used by somebody whose primary language is Egyptian. And for whatever reason, they've suddenly switched to write kete instead of alos or alon or ale at the beginning of this recipe. Very interesting phenomenon. It's difficult to know exactly why they chose to do that here in this manuscript. So now that we're talking about code switching, this is the practice of jumping from one language to another in the middle of speaking. We actually find more advanced examples of this in some of the Greek manuscripts. Now, they're not very common. There's only a few texts in which you really can say that there's not just an Egyptian word, so not just a name of a god or not just a loanword like ibis, but there are occasional cases where we find real entire phrases which are borrowed from Egyptian into the Greek text. And so here we have one of them. We have a phrase here, awon ne, awon nai tekele. This is in a Greek text, but it's not Greek. And in fact, we can translate it fairly easily into English if you consider it as being essentially Egyptian or Coptic. And it says, open for me, O bolt. And you can see that we have the same formula more or less repeated afterwards in Greek. Anoigethi, anoigethi klesteron. So be opened, bolt, for I am Horus the Great, etc. So we find a few examples like this. It's not very common, but we have perhaps half a dozen or so. And what's interesting in particular is that, as I mentioned, we can very often in Coptic see dialectal features, so we can tell where the text comes from. And in this case, the ne and the e at the end of tekeli, this implies to us that we're dealing with a manuscript from the Fayum, or a text from the Fayum. And in fact, this is confirmed by the fact that PGM 36 was bought in the Fayum. So here we have a nice case in which the place where the manuscript comes from and the dialect of the manuscript align, and we can say that the text was probably composed in the place where it was copied, which is also the place in which it was purchased and therefore probably found. So we've talked about loanwords, we've talked about code switching. Now I'm going to talk about the kind of most extreme case of Greek and Egyptian interaction, which is when you write Egyptian in Greek script with the modifications of the addition of demotic letters, which turns it into Old Coptic. So what I've given you here is a list of the texts that we have in Old Coptic script. You can see there's not very many magical texts. There's glosses in PDM 14, and then there's significant Old Coptic sections in PGM 3 and PGM 4. In 2 other demotic magical papyri, we have some glosses, but these are entirely in Greek script. So it's not really clear if we should call them Old Coptic or just Greek glosses. And there's another very interesting case, which I'll talk about briefly, which is a very long text written in an Old Coptic script, as well as demotic. But what's interesting about it is in terms of the state of the language, it's a much older form of the language. So to take the first one of these, PDM 14, this is a 2nd century manuscript. You can see just part of it here. It's a very long text. It's about 4 meters long. And you can see here that parts of it are in Greek. So here we have a Greek formula, but the vast majority of it is written in demotic. It's a very complex manuscript. You can tell that it was built up over a long period of time with notes and additional recipes being added. But whoever copied it therefore had access to various diverse sources that they didn't have access to all at the same time, but also they had access to mixed sources, which were both written in Egyptian and written in Greek. So here, just to give you an example, you can see this is in Greek. The vast majority of the text here and here is written in demotic. Sometimes we have these Old Coptic glosses. So there we have Ram, Shu, or Shao, Shao written in Old Coptic to help us pronounce the word. And occasionally there is hieratic inserted. So at the end of a recipe, it says Nefer Nefer in hieratic, which means it is very good, or it is doubly good, something like that. I wanted to talk about part of it, which gives us a sense of exactly what's going on in this manuscript. So this is a recipe for vessel inquiry. So it's a recipe in which you summon a god to appear into a bowl of water or water and oil. So there's a spoken formula, I am the Lord of Souls, Ori Dimbae, da 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 da. So a long series of magical names. And there's another formula later on, which is to be spoken in another part of the ritual. Begins Yaho, Ip, Eoe, Kintator, etc., etc. So these are just voces magicae, we could say. They don't really tell. Usually we'd say that we can't make sense of them. Now, what's interesting is that not all of these words, but some of these voces magicae, once again, they're written in demotic, but sometimes they have these Old Coptic glosses. So you can see here we have Eoe. So there you have Eoe. You can see it's written in red ink here. And then Nefar Aphoe. So you can see it's written in demotic here, and then in Old Coptic. Now, what's interesting is that the Old Coptic actually has more information than the demotic. So in the demotic, we have this sound so o, nefar. But in the Old Coptic, we have epsilon, sometimes for and sometimes we have eta for So something strange is going on here. Why does the scribe sometimes gloss the sound as and why does he sometimes gloss the sound as So this is the first strange thing. The next strange thing is that we have this word, firi impuni. So here we just have the word only in demotic. There's no gloss to go along with it. But as Jaco Dieleman has suggested, piri really looks like an Egyptian word. It looks like the word piri, which means to come out of. And then we have afterwards, which looks like a preposition from. And then we have puni, which seems like it could be an error for the word panun. So the one who came out of the nun, which would be a way of talking about the primordial God who came out of the primordial abyss. And we actually do find this phrase several other times in the papyrus. So this is interesting because once again, this form, piri, so with an aspiration at the initial part and aspiration here, this looks like a Bohairic form, so a northern form. This manuscript was copied in the south at Thebes, and perhaps this offers us some kind of explanation. They read something which looked like this, piri impunun, which is not the form which they expected. They would pronounce it something like piria impunun. So they saw something which was different from their own dialect. And so instead of copying it in terms of its meaning, so instead of copying it typically with a typical mixture of ideographs and phonetic complements, which you would normally write something in demotic, they wrote it as if it was a magical name. Now, this is a bit strange because this implies that the origin of this text was not written in demotic. It implies it was actually written in the form of Old Coptic, so something which looked like this. The scribe was then transcribing it back into demotic, and when they did so, they decided to keep sometimes the glosses when they offered more information. So this would be an explanation for why we sometimes have epsilon, sometimes we have eta, and why they sometimes didn't recognize Egyptian words because they were written phonetically rather than with ideographic signs or with classifiers. So here we have a case once again of a northern text which is transferred to the south and was copied into a manuscript. So we have here evidence of the transfer of manuscripts in the same way that we have evidence of the transfer of loanwords in the case of words like ibis and komi. So this implies, there are other cases in PDM 14, but this implies a circulation by at least the 2nd century of an extensive magical literature in Old Coptic. And we get a sense of what this was like from British Museum 10808, which is the manuscript I alluded to earlier. It's a very interesting manuscript written primarily, at least in the surviving part, in Old Coptic. So you can see it's probably broken off. It's probably a much larger roll. We have one column on the right, which has demotic instructions mixed with Greek text. But the main text, which you can see here, is written in Old Coptic. Now, the script is Old Coptic, but the state of the language is actually much older. So it resembles a more traditional text, so something written in traditional Egyptian, which is closer to Middle Egyptian. It's a very difficult text. It's not fully understood, but you can see from the short passages which I've given you here, may you give love to the body and heart of so-and-so and every man in this land likewise. It's probably a love or a favor spell. So even though this is a very fragmentary text, it comes from Oxyrhynchus in the north, and it perhaps represents one kind of surviving island of what was probably a much larger Old Coptic literature which was circulating and of which we only have a few traces surviving in, for example, the demotic magical papyri. Now, we also have perhaps a few later examples of this in some of the Old Coptic material of the 4th century, which is usually found in primarily Greek manuscripts. So PGM4 is a good example of this. This is the largest surviving Greek magical papyrus. It consists of 72 pages, primarily written in Greek. Once again, probably copied in Thebes. It was bought in Thebes. And we have, once again, interesting examples of dialectal mixture and different levels of more or less archaic texts in the Coptic content. Now, I won't go into this in detail because this is probably the most discussed Old Coptic manuscript, but it consists of several distinct and very interesting recipes. So one of these is a historiola in which Isis comes to Thoth, her father, to complain about Osiris being unfaithful to her. And then Thoth responds by producing a love spell, which will bring Osiris back. And in the same way, the person who's using it hopes that the love spell will bring a lover to them. This is a very archaic format, so we can find very structurally similar texts going back to the New Kingdom, if not earlier, depending on how strict we want to be in talking about structural similarities. And once again, we can see something very similar to what we see in the demotic text. We can see glosses. So, for example, the word men means with, and we can see an alternative form above it, nem, which is the same word, but just in a different dialect. And again, I won't go into the detail, but this once again suggests that we're dealing with, in fact, once again, a northern text written in something in Bohairic, which has been transmitted and then recopied into the south, and then partly kind of translated or updated into a southern dialect, but not completely. So it guards traces of this earlier stage. There's another very interesting text, which has an almost exact parallel in the Demotic Magical Papyrus of London and Leiden, which is an invocation to Osiris. And so you can see here that it's not an exact parallel, but there are some very close similarities which tell us that this is part of the same textual tradition. So once again, this is another text which is being transmitted from an older form of the Egyptian language into a later form, using Old Coptic as the medium of transmission. What I wanted to end with and talk about in a tiny bit more detail is PGM3. So this is a very interesting manuscript, very fragmentary, as you see. It's very, very difficult to read, really. The geographical location is unknown. The dialect of the Old Coptic is perhaps Sahidic, so suggests that it comes from somewhere in Upper Egypt. Once again, it's primarily Greek in language, but we have a few Old Coptic sections, which are both very difficult to read, but very interesting from a historical perspective. And I just wanted to give you an idea of how hard it is to read by showing you, this is a microscope reading of part of it. You can see here it's almost unreadable in large parts. So this is what really prevents me from giving you a more complete description of it, and which makes it challenging, but hopefully, as you'll see in a moment, the contents are very interesting and make it worthwhile to try to figure out what's going on. So one of the texts is a very long invocation of a figure called the sailor. We have passages which are kind of very typically Greco-Egyptian, so invocation of Yah, Sabaoth, Adonai, but also a constant reference to sailor, who may be a person who the speaker is identifying himself with, or a figure who's being invoked. So if we look at the language, so the word sailor is nef. This is really just the word for sailor, but it clearly refers to a solar deity who's traveling once again in his bark. So it's that same idea which we've seen recurring several times. I haven't been able to find the word sailor, which is really quite a quotidian word referring to the god. We can compare it to titles like Imi Wa'ef, Wia'ef, the one in his bark, which is a common title for the solar deity in older texts. So it's transmitting a much older idea, but it's kind of updating the way in which it talks about the god as a sailor in his bark. We also find this very interesting phrase repeated several times, Lo, son of the great one, so Lo si where. This is quite similar to a phrase which we find already in the pyramid texts, where sawer, so a great one, son of a great one. Now, of course, lo doesn't look like the word where, which means great one, but because it's such an old phrase, I wonder if there's some kind of archaic pronunciation that's going on here, which could explain it. But in any case, we have at least part of a very old concept and a very old epithet, which is being preserved in this Old Coptic text. There's also a description of the god as he who came forth from primeval waters or primordial waters. So pire penun. This is actually almost exactly the same phrase as we saw earlier in the demotic magical papyrus. But what's interesting about it from a grammatical perspective is it uses a periphrastic past participle, this here, which we don't find at all in standard Coptic, although it's very, very common in demotic. So we can see here a lot of very interesting archaic features, which once again suggests that this belongs to what I've called a kind of Old Coptic literature, which is almost lost, but which we have a few surviving branches of in these manuscripts. Another interesting text is found here. It's very, very short, but it seems to be a spell in which the speaker identifies himself with Jesus. So I am Ko-Bo, the great power, etc. I am Jesus, the great God. So of course, one thing that's very interesting is that we have here a reference to Jesus. So this is perhaps one of the earliest references to Jesus in the Egyptian language. But the way in which he's referred to is very interesting. So he's called the first power, Pishosim and Huit, which I've interpreted as Sechem and Huiti. So I haven't been able to find a parallel for this exact phrase, but the reference to a god or a being as a Sechem, a power, is very, very common in Egyptian religion. But it's never found in standard Coptic. So the idea that Jesus is in some way the first emanation of the Father, this is of course a standard unorthodox Christian idea, but the way in which it seems to be expressed here using religious vocabulary drawn from the older Egyptian cults is apparently unique. And likewise, the description of God as, of Jesus as the great God, Peneto, which would be Penecher A'a. So the word, the title Penecher A'a is really very, very, very common in older Egyptian religious texts. It's so banal that I was able to look at almost every Egyptian text which has a god in it, and you'll almost always find the hieroglyphs Necher A'a in reference to them. So here I've just happened to pick a Horus Stela because it, it shows another savior god who we could compare to Jesus in some ways. But this is never used once again in standard Coptic or in Christian texts. So once again, it shows that older Egyptian religious concepts, older Egyptian religious epithets are being used to talk about Jesus. And I don't really have time to talk about this, but we have another example of this in PGM4, where we have an exorcism of God, who is the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, who is Jesus, the Holy Spirit. Once again, this is a very interesting text written in a form of Coptic, but one which reflects a non-Orthodox theology. So in this text, Jesus seems to be the Holy Spirit. So it reflects what we would call a binitarian Christianity, which is something which was attested in the 2nd century, but seems to have then fallen off. So in both of these cases, we have attestations of non-Orthodox Christianity, which are expressed in the Egyptian language, and in the first case, using Egyptian religious concepts, but which essentially preserve lost forms of Christianity, we could say, or lost attempts to make sense of Christianity in the Egyptian language. So to conclude, I wanted to show this fragmentary text, which is actually not a real text. This is the demotic Gospel of Thomas, which is a hoax perpetrated on a prominent demoticist, which eventually he realized was a hoax. But it was an attempt to transcribe the Gospel of Thomas into demotic. And it would have been very interesting because it would attest to the fact that native Egyptian priestly scribes were interested in Christianity and were copying Christian texts. Now, this text, of course, is a fake, but what we see in these Old Coptic texts is something quite similar. We see Egyptian scribes engaging with Christianity, and even in the case of PGM3, attempting to translate Christian concepts into Egyptian religious language. And I think this shows both the complexity and the interest of these texts, in the sense that we get glimpses of literature and ways of thought which are almost completely lost otherwise. So just to quickly resume what we've said, there are lots of different kinds of interaction. These interactions show both interactions of different religions, but also spatial transfer. So the transfer of knowledge, I've suggested primarily from north to south, from the heavily populated delta, which is not really tested papyrologically, to the south in many cases. This is not the case for all of these manuscripts, but it is the case for at least a few of them. And so this tells us something interesting. It allows us to perhaps reconstruct some of the texts which we have lost. We've seen very variable knowledge of each language on the part of composers and copyists. I should emphasize that although I've tried to demonstrate a kind of sequence of development from Greco-Egyptian to Coptic glosses to Old Coptic, and from non-Christian or pre-Christian Old Coptic to Christian Old Coptic, we should say that this development is really a kind of artifact which is created by the story I've been telling. These are not really tested in chronological order. And in fact, the survival of our evidence is really a matter of chance. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you find it interesting, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Korshi, for this excellent paper, and I enjoyed it very much, and I even learned from it. And I hope that everyone else found it as interesting as I did. And I'm looking forward to questions from the audience. Peter or Arpad, could you just say a few words about the procedures of just asking questions? Are there any specific?
Yes, well, anyone who wants
raise
to
your hands, or
yeah, just
or in
raise
the
your
chat.
hands, and you also feel free to put things in the chat. I can call Agnes's attention to them. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Please. Yeah,
I think we have a
Fabiana?
question from Fabiana.
Hi, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. That was beautifully presented, and I've been following your work for quite some time, so quite happy to be here. So my question is about the voces magicae, because as a classical scholar who knows Greek, and I put myself under that category, who knows Greek but does not only not know any Egyptian forms, but in any of the other languages, the other many languages that you mentioned were present in Roman Egypt, we are always incurring in the risk of saying this is gibberish when actually we're talking about either loanwords or full words, pseudo-Hebrew, pseudo-Egyptian, this and that. So I'd be interested to hear more about how you as a team have been approaching this challenge methodologically, when elaborating this edition of the formularies. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your kind remarks and that great question. So this is a really huge problem, and I don't think it's really been resolved. My colleague Panayota Sariskoli is starting a project at the in Thessaloniki, which is going to be looking at voces magicae and trying to gather them and then systematically go through proposals for their origin. So I'm hoping that this project will continue and maybe it will bear fruit in kind of helping us to understand the voces magicae better. But I mean, you're absolutely right. This is a huge problem that we always encounter. I think that, of course, I think the first thing is to accept that we're always going to make mistakes, and that there have been many mistakes in the past, and they're going to continue to make mistakes. And when I was showing you these Old Coptic texts, I was very aware that my interpretation may be wrong. So that's why there are a lot of dots. And when you see the final edition, you'll probably see in the notes, I try to discuss why I've chosen to interpret things a particular way. So just to talk about maybe how I try to go about this, I think I would say there are very few people in the world who are really very good at this. So Joachim Quack is one of them. He's very good at this, but it takes a very, very deep knowledge of the Egyptian scripts and Egyptian language, but also of, occasionally you'll find a demotic text which writes a word more phonetically. There may be, a mummy tablet somewhere, or a mummy label, sorry, somewhere, which has a phonetic writing of a word. So you kind of have to use as many sources as you can to try to reconstruct the words. And of course, you have to have a deep knowledge of Egyptian phonology, which is something that almost nobody living has, unfortunately. So in terms of what I try to do myself is I always try to find an attestation of the word in the language. So that is, in this case, in Egyptian. So that is, I try to find a native Egyptian text which has the phrase, or which has the particular word or title. So I guess you got a little glimpse of that in my PowerPoints, where I was showing you the attested word or the attested parallel in the native Egyptian language. But that's only the first step, of course, because what we have typically in Egyptian writings are consonantal skeletons, which is not really how they are pronounced at any point in history. So the next stage is to then look for attestations of the pronunciation. So I'll go through Coptic texts, if there are Old Coptic texts. So actually the demotic texts are great for this, because sometimes we have the demotic word, and then occasionally we'll have the writing above it. Sometimes there'll be cuneiform writings of the words, but the problem is that this is a New Kingdom thing, typically. So we have attestations of how the word is pronounced in the New Kingdom, and then you have to use that with a bit of caution if you want to try to reconstruct the pronunciation in the Roman period. For me, another big source of information apart from Coptic writings is in things like place names and in personal names. There are a lot of Egyptian words which are tested in Greek writing in personal names and in place names. And so if I can't find a word in Coptic, that'll be my typical next port of call. So it's really to kind of go through all the possible sources that we have to try to argue for why a particular consonant is represented a particular way, why a particular vowel is represented in a particular way. And I would say that it's very important to be careful not to just use the Egyptological pronunciations, because as Egyptologists, when you read a word, we typically add an E between every single consonant, but this is not really how Egyptian was ever pronounced as a real language. So we have to be very careful when we do this. So that's just a few things about the way I typically approach it. But really, it's a huge problem. There are a lot of words which are not attested, and so we have to be very careful. And I think perhaps also for me, one of the things which I always try to do is to signal my uncertainty and to be as honest as I can about it, so that other people can then go ahead and judge it and decide if they find it plausible or not.
Thank you so much.
And maybe if I could quickly say, Ash Sudin has an interesting comment. So the word for the god appears to be Paneto and later Panute. So actually, this is a very interesting phenomenon which doesn't really exist in Coptic, which is that the word Panute has a construct form. So the construct form of Panute is Panet. And then when you add O, which is the word for great, so it'd be Aa in Egyptological pronunciation, you pronounce this Panet O. So this is actually not that Panute is later. Panute is actually just the full form, and Panet is the construct form. So we know about this because we have a lot of examples of this word being written. But this is another problem. So not only do we have to bother with the problem of reconstructing the pronunciation of the word, every word has multiple pronunciations depending on its position within the discourse. So is it a construct form? Is it the full form? Is it a stressed form or not? And this is something which we have very well tested in Coptic for certain words, but for a lot of words like Panute, so typically the nouns, in fact, we don't have all of the forms. So once again, we have to kind of get a sense of it from parallels or from comparing the structure with other words which are better attested. And I can see that TJ has a question.
Hi, thank you for a fantastic paper. It was really, really interesting. You touched on this slightly when you were talking about the sort of use of claiming certain names were Egyptian in order to sort of use their authority. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how some of these linguistic interactions you were talking about might have been used to try and enhance the efficacy of the spells they were doing, the effect how much they believed the languages they were using impacted how effective the spells were.
Yeah, well, I think there's a nice article by David Frankfurter called The Writing of Magic and the Magic of Writing. It's an old one, but I think it's still quite nice. And I think he also has a similar article about this in the Guide to the Study of Ancient Magic. But yeah, I mean, I think your question implies, kind of words of power are very, are kind of major part of magic. So speaking the right words, pronouncing them the right way, and having them be authoritative words. These are all kind of key parts of the magical practice of the Roman period, and I mean, it's something which continues in magical practice later on. So I guess what's interesting about the example which I showed you is that the word is signaled as being Egyptian specifically. So that's a kind of claim to its authority within the text. And in that same passage, I didn't give you, but there are other claims to the power of languages. So it says, this is the name in the language of the birds. This is the language in the name of the baboons. This is the language, I think, in Hebrew, the name of the god in Hebrew. So you can see that there are a lot of different claims to authority. And in fact, there it was also the physikon onoma, so it was the kind of physical or essential name. So there are lots of claims to authority there. And I suppose, I don't really know how much more I can say about that, but perhaps one other thing to notice is the sources of authority. So very often we see, for example, Syrian or Hebrew as authorities. These are, I guess, the kind of authority of these wise people of the Levant. I don't think there are any cases of Persian or Arabic in the magical papyri, but we do often see Egyptian. And I suppose this is actually connected to what's called the names of the nations motif, which Jaco Dieleman has talked about. So this is something which you also see in non-magical hymns, for example, where they'll name a god by different geographical or sites of geographical origin. So your name in Rome is such and such, your name in Cilicia is such and such, your name in Egypt is such and such. And even within Egypt, you'll have your name in Memphis is such and such, your name in Thebes is such and such, your name in I don't know, Sognapai is such and such. So I think this is drawing upon the, I guess, cultural plurality almost as a source of power, which is in a sense the opposite. It's not there's an essential name which belongs to a powerful or an especially holy language. It's almost the fact that you have access to a universal God and you can invoke them through a kind of universal series of languages. And so I have an article which I don't think is out yet, where I talk about this in terms of, I guess, the kind of reach of the Roman Empire in the same way that, Roman triumphs might, display captives from all over the world, or they might talk about how, you can see people from Egypt or from Gaul or from Persia all together in Rome. So it shows its universal power. You can invoke a god by showing that you have access to all of these different geographically situated knowledges. So I hope that partly is a bit rambling, but I hope that answers your question a little bit.
No, that's fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. And I can see that Carl Regulus, I think, has a question.
Yes. Thank you for a great lecture. I was wondering if you have encountered the Egyptian form bay, by, palm branch in connection with the voces magicae of Sessegnon Barfaranges.
Sorry, could you maybe repeat the question again? So Barfaranges, and then
yes, if you have encountered the Egyptian form bay or by palm branch in connection with the voces magicae Sessegnon Barfaranges.
Ah, okay. So to be honest, so I wouldn't personally see a connection between them myself. So the word by is actually, there's a couple of homophones in Egyptian. So there's the word by, which means palm branch. There's also the word by, which we normally pronounce in Egyptology as ba. So like it's a word for the soul. So the ba soul, the human-headed soul. is also pronounced by. So it's actually homophonous with the word for palm branch, coincidentally at this period. Now, in terms of bar pharanges, I guess, so ba does have a construct form, which is ba. So you could say that it's the ba sol of pharanges. But I think that usually in terms of Sisengen bar pharanges, the explanation which I've seen is that it's Sisengen bar, which this would be Aramaic for son of pharanges. So
The crevasse goddess.
I haven't heard of that, but I think it's been explained as maybe you know more about this than I do, but it's been explained as a form of Sashambar Paradush. So this is a figure we find on some Aramaic amulets from Turkey, I think, of the early first millennium.
All right. Thank
sorry?
you.
So if you're interested, feel free to send me an email. I can give you a reference for that. But we have these amulets of Sashambar Paradush, I think, from the early first millennium, and he has various afterlives in later texts, and one of them is this Sisengen bar pharanges.
Okay, thank you. I will do that.
You're welcome.
Are there any more questions in the audience? If not, I would have one, which is, Korshi, you mentioned, talking about Bohairic being the Western Delta dialect, you mentioned that this was like the earliest, the closest part of Egypt to Greece, but Alexandria is also there. Do you think that Alexandria has a role in these processes of Greek and Coptic interaction? And that Bohairic has maybe a role in Alexandria as well?
Yeah, so we don't know what the dialect of Alexandria is. I don't know if anybody's tried to reconstruct it, but to be honest, my impression is that it would be relatively close to Bohairic. So my impression is that if we saw it, it would look something like Bohairic, because that is the kind of region where we find Alexandria. So yeah, so that's kind of what I'm thinking of, is that, of course, there's no way to prove it, but when we have a lot of these texts that are apparently being composed in the north and which are then coming south from a relatively early period, this does imply to me that people in Alexandria or around Alexandria may be involved in it. But that'd actually be a very interesting project, would be to look, I guess, at the church fathers maybe, or other writers who are based in Alexandria, and see when they cite Egyptian words, what form they cite them in. But the problem is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have very few citations of Egyptian words in Greek authors, unfortunately. I think Athanasius Kircher already found most of them. So yeah, so as you implied, I think that probably Alexandria does play an important role here, even if we can't really be more precise about it, unfortunately.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. Yeah, thank you. Are there any other questions here? Yes, if there is none, then I will probably just give back the word to Peter and Arpad to say some final.
I do know, Fabiana, do you have a question?
No, that was just the
Oh, that was
applause.
just a goodbye. All right. Well,
Oh
thank you
no,
very
there
much.
is one
sorry.
more in the
Oh,
chat.
yes, one more. Okay, go ahead.
There's one more question in the chat by Dan Deek. How does isopsephy appear in Coptic Magical Papyri? That's like quite, but that's something for Korshi.
Sorry, it's a good question, but to be honest, I'm not quite sure if I can answer it satisfactorily. So in the text which I talked about today, I don't think we really see isopsephy at work, at least as far as I've been able to see. In the later Coptic Magical Papyri, we maybe do have them. So I think it was Helmut Zatzinger. It was maybe Helmut Zatzinger who had a very interesting paper which he published online, but which was never, or it's really PowerPoint. I think it was Helmut Zatzinger, I might be wrong, who basically went through a lot of the larger Coptic Magical Papyri and tried to identify the names, for example, of the 9 guardians as isopsophistic, so to calculate how they would, what their totals would be, and then to relate that to the symbolism. So say that this is 333 or 666 or 999, so this perhaps relates to the Trinity. My impression, though, is that you sometimes have to do a bit of manipulation. So you often have to like multiply it by X amount and then do something else to it to get the numbers to add up. And my impression is that even names like that are very well known to be Aesop-sophistic, like Abrasax, for example, we often find them copied in strange ways in the magical papyri. So my impression is that the magical papyri are not typically, at least the Coptic ones, are not typically using isopsephism. There may be examples which I just don't have to hand just now, in which you do see it. But I would say that it's not really a major concern in the Coptic magical papyri in the same way that we do sometimes find it in the Greek papyri. Sometimes they'll explicitly say the value of this name is X number, for example, or use the name with X value. But this may be something, this may say more about me than about the text themselves, because to be honest, I don't really like adding up things and then trying to figure out what else. Well, actually, you know what? There's a big exception to this, which is, of course, the names of Michael and the other archangels. This is found in a lot of sites in Nubia where you have typically sequences of 3 letters, which are actually number totals and which typically add up to the names of, for example, Gabriel, Michael, Raphael. I think there's also Jesus and a whole series of others. So not all of those are identified, but we often find the same fixed sequence. There's a good discussion of this in Jack van der Vliet and Adam Whitar's Empowering the Dead. I think they give a list of some cases, but it's not something that you typically find, at least in my experience, in the magical papyri from Egypt. It's something which is more a kind of popular practice that you often find in particular physical sites. It's often written on walls of temples or of temples of churches, or of private dwellings. But yeah, as I was saying, perhaps it's just something that is not really part of my my personality to calculate the numbers of every word. And perhaps if I did it more often, perhaps I would find more isopsephism.
Yeah, thank you
Well,
very much. Yes.
well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for your questions. Thank you very much to Korshi for an absolutely fantastic paper. It was really thrilling and wonderful, and I feel I've learned so much from it. And it's just a fascinating area about which I knew nothing when you started to speak, and now I feel I know very little about but something. And I also wanted to thank our colleague Agnes Mihaiko, who I should have given a proper introduction to at the start. She's a postdoc at the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna and at the University of Oslo. Her main field of work is Christian liturgical papyri. And is your book out, or is it coming out, Agnes?
I have one out and one coming, but
One out and one coming. Splendid.
I'm not the protagonist here.
It's very lively.
That's-
And she's, as you've
Yeah.
seen, she's also also very much an expert on Coptic literature and language. So it's been really thrilling to have such a wonderful concentration of knowledge and skill here today. So thanks everyone. And this is this would be our last Graeco-Aegyptiaca lecture for the year. I think it's ended very well this season, and we'll be back in the autumn with a new series of papers that we hope will interest you. So thanks very much. And